All right. So I remember when I was a kid listening to the news about a particular ship. Some of you have seen these big ore carriers, grain carriers up in huge ships, right up in Duluth. Anybody heard of that? The Fitzgerald? Scott Fitzgerald? Yeah. Somebody later wrote a song about it. I was listening to this going, what happened to that big, huge boat? How can you lose a big, huge boat like that? But the song went something like, legend goes on from the Chippewa on down, but the big lake they call Gitchigumi. Talked about when the winds of November come early. And the winds of November of the fall and the winter came early, and that huge boat disappeared. Sunk to the bottom, split in half, because of the big winds just on Lake Superior. But, Lake Superior's taken down a lot of boats. I've snorkeled on a few. But there are also people who go on the oceans, sometimes not in that big a boat. So what happens with all of the violent storm? Who's in control with all that happens? Anybody ever been in a big storm? Yeah? Some of you have? All right, I have. So violent storms, who is in control? We're looking at Acts 27. Storm Daniels is one that just happened last month, wasn't it? About a month ago in early September. A hurricane in the Mediterranean Sea. I didn't even know the Mediterranean Sea had hurricanes, but dumped all kinds of rain on Greece and moved around, and then dumped a whole bunch of rain on Libya and broke some dams there. And the people, especially in one town, did not have any warning about what was going to happen, and the dam wasn't kept up well, and 4,333 people dead and 8,500 missing. That was the lowest number I could find. So I don't know exactly what it's been counted to yet, and you saw some of that news. What do you do in a storm like that? And no, there's more violent storms happening. That seems pretty obvious that there's more violent storms. They said this particular storm was because the sea was so much warmer because of climate change. There was 50 times more likely to have that kind of storm happen. And I don't know, it was 20 times more likely for it to be that severe. But this is a question. Do you ever pray about climate change? I thought about this myself, and I thought, I never pray about climate change. I hear about it, I think about it, I discuss it with people, but I never pray about climate change. Why is that? So, what about weather? What about climate change? Who is in control? And what action should we take in the middle of a storm or in the middle of a whole world that there's global warming and climate change? Some people say no one's in control. It's just happening, and so just enjoy life. And a lot of people, if they're honest, that's what they should say. I mean, if it isn't global warming, the sun's going to blow up, there's going to be nuclear, whatever. We're only here for just enjoy life as long as you can, and why worry about it, right? Probably not going to really make a big difference before we're gone. And human race is all coming to an end eventually anyways, right? If people really believe that, they'd be consistent to just enjoy life. And some people are like, oh, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to bother with it. Or other people say, we are. So we should do stuff. And that's good, but then there's a lot of fear and anxiety that comes around that. And like, man, if we don't get this, it keeps, and it's on, and it's going to get in its word. So that, are we in control of the climate? Can we influence the climate? So those are some of the questions. So, or maybe there's another option, another answer to that question. So here is one picture. I was looking for all these pictures. There's some great ones online, but I couldn't really collect them all. There's a nice little video showing it move across the Greece, dumping rain there. So the center of it moved around like this. Here's the island of Malta. And I happened to think about that because that's also right exactly where Paul and Luke and a friend of theirs were in a huge storm. Gale force winds. So this isn't entirely new. This stuff happens. What can we learn from what happened to Paul in that time? So what's your prison? What's your storm? Not maybe literally, maybe specifically you have a prison or a storm. What area of your life do you feel threatened? Are you afraid? Or out of control? Maybe it's not the weather, maybe it's the economy, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's raising your kids, maybe it's those crazy parents, maybe it's, I don't know. What area of your life, maybe it's your health, where you feel threatened and out of control? You got one thing in mind? Or are you all good? You all just fine? I feel a little threatened about some things sometimes. So what is God doing in your prison or your storm? We were asking that question. We said God loves He's loving you, He's loving Paul in this case, by being present. He's with you in your storm. He's with Paul in this storm. He protects Paul, protects you. He purifies us from idols. You're going to see in this story, they throw out a lot of food, throw out a lot of tackle that they had been controlling the ship. They throw out a lot of stuff just trying to survive. And above all, he's fulfilling his purposes in Paul's life, and he wants to fulfill his purposes in your life. So we talked about what are God's purposes for your life. We know what some of the purposes are because they're true for everybody, like witnessing to Jesus, following Jesus' example, loving people, loving God. What specific purpose or purposes has he shown you? Are there some specific ones that you may not know exactly how he's going to make those happen, but God's talked to you about some specific things that you want to see God do? Are you praying about those things? Write them down. Keep them before God. And sometimes it's amazing when you go back and find out, wow, I wrote that down, and God actually did that. I've done that a lot. Sometimes in the margin of my Bible, sometimes in a journal, and amazed how God works out his purposes. And sometimes he gives me a glimpse of them ahead of time. So what purposes was God working out in Paul's life? Specific ones were going to Rome. He told him a number of times he was going to send him to Rome, writing Paul's letters from prison, and then also Luke Acts. So we talked about how Paul is stuck in prison, so he can't visit people, so he has to write letters, and we're so grateful because that means we get to read his letters. But also, Luke was traveling with Paul, and now he's stuck because Paul's in prison, so he's trying to feed him and whatever. But so what's he going to do? Well, I guess I'll just hang out with Philip in Caesarea and ask him some questions about what happened in the early days of the church, and maybe I'll see if I can talk to Mary and ask her about what it was like for Jesus to be born, and ask some other people around here about the early days. So Luke is hanging out in Israel with Paul, and he's doing interviews. He says that in Luke. I have carefully investigated with eyewitnesses and other accounts about exactly what happened with Jesus and with the early days of the church. So Luke is doing his research. So Paul being stuck in jail not only lets Paul write, it also gives Luke time to do research. And then we're going to find out Luke gets an even more, we call it participant observation research, related to what we're going to talk about today. Whoops. And then finally, witness. Because Paul is clearly called to witness to the good news of Jesus, to make disciples. And we're going to see how God does that. And how could God do that if Paul and Luke and another friend are the only ones in a boat of over 200 people, and they have no power? How could they witness to Jesus? If Paul's a prisoner, how can he be a witness? Some of you are saying, I can't really be a witness at my workplace because I don't really have any influence or any control, and if I do stuff, it might not be too good, and who knows what they would do to me. And some of us can feel pretty out of place when Paul's in chains. He's got no control. And yet we're going to see how he is a witness in this situation. So there's the map, but I thought, as long as Luke was actually an eyewitness to this, It would be much better if we asked Luke what happened. I mean, he did write it down for us, but I just thought, let's ask Luke. Yeah, y'all laughing at me, huh? You guys don't wear these? You just stick them in the bottom of the boat? Yeah, that's going to do you a lot of good. Tell you the truth, we didn't have these, but they're awesome. I wish I had one of these. Tell you what, I wish I had one of these, because I'm going to tell you what happened to me. So I know you guys are reading my book. There's certain sections of the book where it says we. That's like I was there. So chapter 27, you can look it up because I wrote it down. But when the time came, we set sail for Italy. We're going to Rome finally. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius. Julius is a captain of the imperial regiment. Now, Julius is, he's a captain, but he turns out he's a pretty good guy in the end. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. Now, it was hard for us to get on the boat because we didn't really have a reason to be on the boat, but we were kind of saying, well, we're helping out Paul. We're kind of slaves of Paul. We're going along to make sure he's okay because, somebody's got to take care of him. So we left on the ship whose home port was Adramyttium on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. We were scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. Now, you guys don't know much about that, but there we are. We're going right along here and on our way to Rome. Yeah, so we docked in Sidon, and Julius was very kind to Paul. Turns out Julius was an okay guy. He let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus right up here, trying to stay out of the wind a little bit, but still get enough wind to keep going. And we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy and put us on board. So we hitched on this one ship. We switched ships right here to a grain ship. We had several days, though, of slow sailing. And after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus, right there. Whoops. Right there. So, but the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the shelter of the island past the Cape of Salmon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lycia, right there. We were trying to get up to here, so we had lost a lot of time. And the winds of November come early. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. And they're like, what do you know? You're a prisoner. He had 3,500 miles of sea voyages under his belt. He had done a lot of traveling, so he did know something, but it wasn't just his scientific knowledge, his interpretation of the weather, his knowledge from experience. Paul had something else they didn't know about. He was listening to somebody else as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. I don't know who you're listening to. But since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, rather further up the coast of Crete and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. So we were just going to go from here to here, a 3-hour tour, right? So, Phoenix was good. So when a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete, but the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, a hurricane called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. we sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, right there, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it so that it wouldn't fall apart. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of Citrus off the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard, lightening things up. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. We knew we were dead. We couldn't see the sun or the stars, so we didn't even know where we were going. We were sick as could be. We were throwing up until there was nothing to throw up because we were tossed all over the place. And it was terrifying to be in the dark and just be blown around in the middle of a hurricane. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Greece. You should have avoided all this. You could have avoided all this damage and loss. Sometimes it makes sense to listen about how we should respond to the weather, about what God is doing in the midst of things. When somebody has some insight, we might want to listen." And Paul had insight from God. You could have avoided all this damage and loss, but take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whose I am, stood beside me. God's angel was with Paul. He was with us in the middle of the dark, in the hurricane. And Paul told him who he was. He said, "I'm not your prisoner. I'm a prisoner of God. I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. He is the one I belong to, and he is here with me." And he said, he's not just a prisoner, he's a prophet. He's Jesus's. And Paul was fulfilling his purpose, and he said, "Don't be afraid, Paul." The angel told me, "Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you." People sailing with us sometimes get some benefits. "So take courage, for I believe God, it will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island." Paul told him, "I believe God. He knows what he's saying. He sent an angel to be with me. We're going to be safe, but we're going to be shipwrecked." You made some stupid choices, folks, but God is still going to take care of us. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, 14 nights, we were out there for 2 weeks in a hurricane, in the dark. As we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore, so they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You'll all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. They started listening to Paul. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all. Some prayed with him. Some didn't know who he was praying to, but he prayed to Yahweh. He prayed to Jesus. Thanks God before them all, and broke out and ate. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore, but they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship struck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Paul was protected. We were protected. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. Now, if we'd had one of these, we wouldn't have had to been trying to hang on to planks. But, God saved us, every one of us, 276 of us. Because in the midst of that, in the midst of all of that, who was in control? Were the sailors in control? Who holds your life in storms? Who is your life preserver? Yeah. I don't wear one of these all the time. I sure do when I get in a ship. But I learned that my real life preserver that I wear all the time, who holds me all the time, is Jesus. Who holds you in the midst of everything that's happening in our world and in you? Who's got you? Jesus saved us. He resurrected us practically. We were as good as dead. And he resurrected us in the midst of the storm. God loved us, and he loves you. He loves you. By being present with you in the middle of whatever your storm is right now, or whatever storm you might fear is coming that you don't know about, in the midst of climate change, in the midst of whatever, God is present. He protects us. God is purifying us from idols. There's a lot of things we might have to throw overboard. But above all, he fulfills his purpose for us. You believe that? Do you believe God's fulfilling his purpose for us together? It's a little stormy maybe. Do you believe God's fulfilling it in your life? Yes, he wants to. He's in control. There's an opportunity to fulfill his purposes. So weather and climate change, who's in control of the weather? What action can we take? You can say no one's in control, it just happens, just enjoy life. Most people, if they were consistent in their beliefs, they'd say that, they just do that. Or we are, but because we actually control so little, that leaves us with quite a bit of fear and anxiety. Or we can say God is in control. Because God is in control. And we can trust God. And he showed it many times in Scripture. He parted the Red Sea. He blew in some quail. He calmed the storm when Jesus was in it. When Elijah, they were trying to decide which gods they worshiped. The real god of weather was Baal. So it was good to have Yahweh for certain things, but Baal you needed for storms and weather and rain. And Elijah said, no, you pick. It's not going to rain for 3 years. And he prayed about the weather. Because God told him to, and it didn't rain for 3 years. And they found out, whoa, maybe Baal doesn't control the weather. And then he prayed, and lightning struck when he prayed, and rain came when he prayed, but it didn't. Baal had nothing to do with it. He was mocking. Is Baal asleep, or is what? Science is a good thing, but science is not in control of the weather. It can give us some good indications about what the weather's going to do and what maybe the temperature is going to be and so forth, but science can't control weather. It can show us, predict some things, But God's in control. We need to trust God. Now, God has given us responsibility to care for creation for His glory. So, people who say we should watch emissions, we shouldn't have a lot of carbon, we should save energy, we should do all these things, that's true. That's just being good stewards of creation so it glorifies God. When people are afraid that an animal is going to go extinct, I mean, survival of the fittest, who cares? No, they say, oh, it's going to be extinct. Because that animal is actually made to glorify God. We don't want it to stop being able to glorify God. So people forgot why we have to care for creation, why we have to care about the weather, why we have to care about what our climate is doing. It's not for us. It's to glorify God. Be good stewards of the creation that He gave us. And that's why we do it. We don't do it out of fear. We do it out of stewardship. Because God is in control, we can trust Him. And then we pray, and we listen, and we obey. So pray about the weather. Don't just look at Google. And you can also, when you look at Google, pray about what you should wear. So adapting to the weather is a good idea, right? And pray about climate change and ask what you should do. Not just wring your hands and fret and argue about it. What can I do? And then listen. And then do it. Even if it's maybe a little uncomfortable to do it. You with me? Whatever the situation is, God is in control. Whatever your storm is, God is in control. You can trust Him. You can listen. And you can obey what He tells you. And if you do obey, you're going to have a lot less damage, probably. Right? And if you didn't obey earlier, at least obey now. So that God can rescue you out of the trouble that you got yourself in by not listening earlier. But when we pray, we don't just ask God for stuff. We also ask Him what we should do. And we listen and we obey. So here's my own personal experience. And some of you have heard this story. 1978, I'm in 10th grade. Let's see, how old are you? Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're not anywhere near 10th grade. You're closer than I am, though. So anyways, I'm sleeping in a pup tent, sleeping just fine, and then wake up because there's a freight rate train running over me. There's a huge sound of wind, and I wake up and trying to get the tent open, and as I'm doing that, trying to get the tent open, my dad is right over here in our beautiful camper, laying down, and he jumps up and says, something's going to happen. And my mom gets up, and my mom puts her shoes on because Dad would say she doesn't like to go anywhere without her shoes on. And then he'd say, and then I try to put my pants on because I don't like to go anywhere without my pants on. And as they're doing that, a tree falls across their bed where their heads were. And if you look at this picture, you can see a branch of that tree right there. That's a branch of the tree. That's not the tree or the bigger branch. It was 10, 12 inches that fell right there. Another one fell on top of it. As I am getting out of the tent, finally get it open, I come around and I yell. They open the door. It's pitch black. Another branch comes and rips the door off the hinges right after they opened it. So by the time I get there, right around the corner, I have to duck under this branch that has fallen there. So now we go over to the car, we get in the Dodge Dart, and we put the back seat up, and we crouch down on the bottom and try to stay down there. Another tree hits the corner of the Dodge Dart, and my mom is saying, Jesus, 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 Jesus. And my dad is saying, God's got it all in control. God's got it all in control. And I'm yelling, I wish I could believe that! But they can't hear me because the storm is too loud. And then we get up, we start looking around camp. This was family camp in Sand Hill Lake Bible Camp where some of you have been. And there were 250 plus people. My dad was the director. He was responsible for all these people. And nobody knew, including him, any of this was happening. Nobody had heard any warnings. Nobody had listened to the radio or the warnings. Nobody got the notifications you all got on Wednesday about, we didn't have cell phones. We're at camp. And so we searched around. There was one pup tent that was flat. We didn't know where this guy was. We finally searched around, and we found him. He'd gone to sleep in one of the dorms. So most of the people are in campers. Some of the people are in the dorms that are still there. But 250 people, nobody was injured when this thing blew through our campground. And so that made me think, well, so we spent the rest of the time trying to make at least enough headway so we could get through the roads, and maybe we could even get electricity eventually. Camp turned into work camp. And yeah, that was what was left of the camper there. And we forgot to put the insurance on that year. But somebody donated some money, and we were able to replace the top half and have a camper again. But we didn't trust the camper. God's in control. Later that year, I could feel, there was a tornado warning, and we were hiding in the root cellar, and I was like, Jesus, 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 Jesus. I know God's in control. He did it before, but I don't know. And I felt bad because God had saved us already, and why was I so doubting when I had already seen him do this miracle? And then the next year at youth camp, which was not in Foston, was in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, we were sitting in our bunks in these wooden bunk houses that they had in Grantsburg, Wood Lake Bible Camp, and I could feel the weather. And I was laying there praying Psalm 23 and praying everything I could think of because I felt this weather. Nobody was warning me, but I knew that there was something. And then somebody came and knocked on the door, talked to the counselor, and the counselor started talking to us. You know, there's kind of some incident. Everybody's just laying there talking, whatever. He said, let's get up and get your pants on. There's a tornado. Woo! Well, that did it. We all got our pants on. And as soon as he said that, it clicked for me. God's in control. And I had a friend on each arm going, ah! I was like, it's okay. God's in control. We'll just walk to the dining hall. And ever since then, at least tornadoes and that kind of weather, I've been, God's in control. Sometimes we learn in a terrible thing that we get that trauma in us and we never forget it and it's hard to undo. But I guess it's called exposure therapy. Well, God gave me exposure therapy with 3 incidents in 1 year of tornadoes to convince me that God's in control. Now, and nobody was hurt at youth camp either. It wasn't as bad at youth camp. But God is in control of the weather, of the climate, of the economy, not just of your spiritual life individually. He really is the creator of everything. He really is in charge of everything. We really can pray to him about everything. I really can pray to him about climate change. And I've started for a few days now. Because God is big enough to handle that. And I can also listen when I pray and say, what should I do about this thing? I know I can't change the climate and the weather, but I can be obedient. And maybe I just end up hearing something that helps rescue me or a few people in a situation. But so, Jesus is in control. Say it with me. Jesus is in control. All right, right after me. I'm going to say it. Jesus is in control. Jesus is in control. That means I can trust him. It means I can listen. And he'll tell me stuff like he told Paul stuff. Maybe from experience, from a lot of sea travel, maybe from listening to the radio, maybe from scripture, maybe he'll speak something directly to me or to a friend who will talk to me. And then I can obey. I got a choice when he tells me something, to obey it or not. So my dad never traveled again without a weather radio. He immediately bought a weather radio, and one that would turn on whenever there was a weather alert and tell him if there was a weather alert. You could always check what the weather was. This was before Google, right? So, but he never went to camp as director again without having a weather radio. He was going to listen next time because he felt responsible for all those people. He praised God that they had been safe, but he wanted to be ahead of things. So it makes sense to listen to everything, including the weather radio. So you take appropriate action. So James, you come on up and with your team. let's worship. And he's picked some great songs, fit in with this. What is it that you are not sure God is in control of in your life or in our world? What are the things that you don't even pray about because you think that's just not even a spiritual thing to talk about? As you go out today, I want to encourage you to tell somebody a story about when God was in control that you didn't know he was going to be in control. Or tell them, if you're really brave, tell them how you're not sure he's in control in this situation in your life right now. And ask him to pray for you. We do that for each other here. So, go in the name of the Father who loves you, of Jesus who died for you, of the Spirit who is with you and filling you and enabling you to be his witness. Go out into this beautiful creation in the fellowship of your Creator, knowing that he is in control. And then watch him do his stuff. Pray, listen, obey. And discover Jesus in this week. May God bless you.